Content warning: psychological trauma related to abuse, violence, and grief. Psychological trauma is the result of an adverse experience that creates an impairment in how the brain functions. This includes anxiety, panic attacks, irritability, obsessions, compulsions, guilt, and a permanent and often negative change in personality. The adverse experiences often contain violence, abuse, abandonment, as well as other devastating life events. A horror movie generally depicts a traumatic event. A trip to a cabin in the middle of the woods turns deadly. An evening of house sitting for a neighbor ends up being not what it seemed, or some other calamity. If the protagonist of a horror film survives the adverse experience, it would be reasonable to assume that they would suffer psychological trauma following its conclusion. It is possible that the protagonist might heal to some degree, but it is also possible that a recurrence, such as the reintroduction of the traumatic event, might cause greater trauma, or at the very least hinder the healing process, much as it is in real life. In the horror movie Scream, the protagonist, Sydney, has already suffered a traumatic event. Her mother was killed. Arguably, she suffers from anxiety, depression, and even guilt over potentially accusing the wrong man, Cotton Weary. Over the course of the film, Sydney suffers another traumatic event. Sydney survives the massacre revealed to be committed by two people that she trusted, one of whom was her boyfriend. The boyfriend is also revealed to be the mother's true killer. Although undoubtedly grateful to be alive, such an experience will likely result in psychological trauma, particularly as it relates to trust and feeling safe among friends. In Scream 2, Sydney suffers a recurrence of the traumatic event as a new killer or killers, wearing the exact same mask, begins killing people around her. Sydney's psychological trauma and inability to fully trust someone begins to make functioning in her day-to-day life challenging. She is unable to properly pursue her goal of becoming an actor. In the climax, Sydney begins to suspect her new boyfriend is the killer, something purposefully provoked by the actual killer. Because of this, not only is he unable to help her in the climax, but he himself is also killed by the real killer. In Scream 3, having suffered multiple similar traumatic events, Sydney becomes agoraphobic and feels unsafe at all times. She shuts herself away, even as another recurrence is happening. Sydney eventually finds the courage to face the ghost-face killer again, this time revealed to be her half-brother, who provoked her original boyfriend into killing her mother in the first place. The original traumatic event. Sydney defeats the embodiment of her trauma and tries to live a normal life. In Scream 4, Sydney claims to have properly healed from her adverse experiences, even writing a book about her psychological trauma. However, because this is a sequel, Sydney is doomed to suffer yet another adverse experience to trigger her anxiety and other psychological maladies. The amount of recurring trauma Sydney suffers is absurd. Nevertheless, the progression of her trauma over the course of the first three films and her attempts at therapy and recovery in the fourth film mirror more mundane versions of psychological trauma that people in real life face. Watching a horror movie with certain elements that remind someone of their adverse experience could trigger symptoms of their psychological trauma, anxiety, panic attacks, etc. However, studies show that horror movies can also be cathartic for people suffering from this trauma. The victim can be introduced to their phobia, or something that would normally trigger symptoms of their psychological trauma, but in a controlled and safe experience. Victims of psychological trauma should read about potential triggers before watching, of course, so that the experience has a better chance of being healing instead of triggering. In short, watching horror movies can sometimes train the body to better handle situations in which psychological trauma is triggered. In fact, the victim might become so comfortable with horror movies that they may feel a sense of control over their trauma. This may be especially useful when watching a horror movie that is particularly relevant to the victim's individual psychological trauma. It, Chapters 1 and 2, tell the story of a recurring trauma that follows children into adulthood. A psychological trauma stemming from a childhood incident is often called an adverse childhood experience, or ACE, and can be especially potent. In the first film, Bill has several traumatic experiences, including losing his brother Georgie at a young age, and the subsequent dealings with Pennywise. Bill's friends, collectively called the Losers Club, all suffer adverse childhood experiences as well. Many of these experiences are related to Pennywise, but some of these experiences are natural, not supernatural. Eddie is a victim of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, with his mother as the abuser. Beverly is abused by her own father, who has a perverse obsession with her. Richie is bullied on the suspicion that he is gay. Everyone in the Losers Club is already suffering before they meet Pennywise. When the Losers Club grows up and leaves town, they all forget about the events of the film. The town of Derry makes people forget once they leave. Mike, who never left, calls them many years later to bring them back to town to face Pennywise again. Although the events that tie both films together are supernatural, they mirror real-life psychological trauma. When Mike makes his calls, we can liken this to a trauma trigger, something that reminds the victim of the adverse experiences and induces symptoms of the psychological trauma. For example, when Richie answers the phone, he becomes physically ill. When Eddie answers the phone, he loses control of his vehicle and crashes. Bill begins stuttering again, as he did when he was a child. When Stanley answers his phone, he commits suicide. Although Stanley's suicide is later revealed to be more complicated than simply the result of the trigger, it does mirror real-life suicidal ideation stemming from psychological trauma. The now adult Losers Club is also still affected by their more mundane traumas. Beverly is trapped in a cycle of abuse, this time with her husband. While the events of both films might be challenging for someone to watch if they suffered an adverse childhood experience, it is also possible that the victim might gain a catharsis so long as they know ahead of time any potential triggers in the film. Watching children grow up and return to face the embodiment of their trauma can be very satisfying. In The Babadook, Amelia is still grieving the loss of her husband. She is depressed and has fears about what this grief is doing to her son, Samuel. She reads a book to Samuel called Mr. Babadook. The creature from the book begins to stalk Amelia and frighten Samuel. The Babadook, much like grief itself, cannot simply be defeated. As it is said in the film, you can't get rid of the Babadook. When the grief monster faces off with Amelia, she shouts that grief cannot have her son. She won't be destroyed by grief, and she will stay as strong as she can to protect her son from it. In the end, the Babadook is not slain like some slasher villain. Instead, it is contained and even fed, a metaphorical stand-in for therapy and healing, perhaps. Trauma must be treated instead of ignored. The Babadook is a therapeutic film for those suffering from the grief of a lost loved one, or any psychological trauma that feels like a monster stalking its victim. The 2018 film Halloween features a story of agoraphobia, paranoia, anxiety, alcoholism, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Although Laurie's trauma and how she deals with it is quite over the top and elaborate, the portrayal of someone suffering from post-traumatic stress following an adverse experience rings true. The promise of the ending of a slasher movie is that the final girl is now safe. However, that is often not true, and Halloween 2018 exposes this. 40 years prior to the events of the film, Michael Myers stalked Laurie Strode on Halloween. Laurie was able to escape, but not without psychological damage. Laurie raised her daughter Karen to fight, to shoot, to potentially kill, and to be fearful of the world. Laurie eventually lost custody of Karen due to this extreme childhood. Although one might claim that the events of the film show that Laurie's fears were well-founded, in the climax, Laurie admits to Karen that the way she raised her was wrong, and that it was the mother's job to protect the daughter from Michael and other threats, not to train Karen in what she calls a cage. Bear in mind before watching the film that Halloween is not always great with its representations of the mentally ill. Even ignoring Michael, the other patients are portrayed as nearly inhuman, howling and making animal sounds. I hope this has been helpful to someone out there. There is no quick fix or perfect cure to trauma, but seeking treatment and receiving proper medication are the best ways to process the pain. Horror movies and other exposure therapy methods are helpful but are only supplementary. If you are suffering from untreated psychological trauma, here are some resources that might be helpful in beginning the healing process.